We are live.
Good morning, folks. Welcome to our planning committee meeting for February the 16th. I'm in the chair for the meeting, and Councillor Carpenter, as the acting filling in mayor of the month in the absence of both Mayor Davis and Councillor Martin, will be chairing the statutory hearing. So let me ask, first of all, if anyone has a declaration of conflict of interest this morning. And I don't see any. Next, I'm going to ask for separation of items. Of course, the planning hearings are all separated. Are there any separations? We have one consent item. We have one for consideration. Seeing none, I'm going to ask for a resolution for the stuff that's not separated. Thank you, Councillor Carpenter, and thank you, Councillor Sicoli. We have that on the floor. If the clerk would like to take the vote on those items. And there we go. Thank you. So that concludes my work in the chair. And now I'm going to hand off to Councillor Carpenter, the acting mayor, to conduct the statutory hearing.
Thank you, Councillor McCurry. Well done. There is one public meeting on today's agenda. The public meetings are held in accordance with the provisions of the Planning Act. The purpose of the hearing is to discuss the planning application and to hear from the public either in support or against the application. At the end of each of the public meetings, the committee will pass a recommendation of which is generally considered for a final decision at the next council meeting. The name of anyone who speaks in regard to any item will appear within the meeting minutes. Anyone wishing notice of any further proceedings regarding the applications should also provide their name and address to the clerk's office. We ask that members of the public in attendance today speak to the item. Please ensure that you add your contact information to the sign-in sheet located at the delegates table at the front. The applicant will speak first, followed by the municipal staff, and then the public. The applicant will then have an opportunity to provide a clarification to any questions or issues raised during the meeting, the public portion. We'll now consider item 4.1, zoning amendment application PZ 2022-620 Cobra Street West. I now ask the applicant or his agent to please come forward and state your name and present your application, please.
You just press the microphone base, the button on the right-hand side. Thank you. My name is Catherine Nerscher, planner with MHBC. I am here on behalf of Live Communities, the owner of 620 Colborne Street West. And with me today is Jason Mosdell, senior manager with Live Communities, and Matthew Baudouin, principal at Timmins Martell Heritage Consultant. Today's meeting focuses on the proposed zoning bylaw amendment for a small portion of 620 Colborne Street West. The application proposes to allow an open space restricted zone for a portion of the lands in order to protect existing archaeological resources while addressing a condition of draft plan approval as directed by LPAT. Next slide, please. The site is located on the south side of Colborne Street West, just east to the border of Brant County. The property has 320 meters of frontage along Colborne Street West and is approximately 54 acres in size. Pleasant Ridge Road runs along the west, while Evergreen Court and Dobney Road run to the east. To the south of the site is the rail trail. Next slide, please. The lands subject to this application are approximately 1.25 acres in size and shown by the smaller box within the subject property. Next slide, please. The site is currently vacant. However, some construction activities have begun on site. To the north of the property are commercial uses, and to the east and west are residential. And to the south, as mentioned, is open space with connections to the rail trail. Next slide, please. Staff have done a great job of outlining the history and background of the property in their report and the public notice, so I'll provide just a brief overview. The property was purchased in 2018 by Live Communities, and at that time, a draft plan of subdivision had already been submitted to the city. The application was subsequently appealed to the then Ontario Municipal Board, and through the board's ruling, a condition of approval noted that the owner agrees if a stage 3 or 4 archaeological study results in the identification of areas that cannot be developed, the owner shall apply for and receive approval of a zoning bylaw amendment to place these areas in a protected open space zone. At the time of issuing this condition of appeal, the archaeological reporting had not yet been completed. Through ongoing works and studies carried out by TMHC, it was identified that an area on the west side of the property contained a significant archaeological find site, and it would be preferable to have it remain undisturbed. Through these works, the surrounding Indigenous communities were consulted along with the ministry to ensure all parties were in agreement with the findings and next steps in maintaining these lands as undisturbed area. Additional works were carried out to clearly identify the area to which was remain untouched, which has become the subject of the zoning application before you today. Next slide, please. To provide some brief policy context to the property, the subject lands are within the residential designation of the city's official plan. The residential designation permits uses such as open space. Next slide, please. Through the LPAT decision, the lands subject to the amendment today have been zoned HR4A 72. This zone allows for street townhouses, back-to-back townhouses, and dual frontage dwellings. The proposal seeks to amend the highlighted area in red as open space restricted. This will ensure the long-term protection of the existing archaeological resources while implementing the draft plan conditions as issued by LPAT. Next slide, please. For additional context, shown here is the site plan layout for the west side of 620 Colborne Street West. The area highlighted in red is the area subject to the zoning application. The area is proposed to be a passive park with walking trails, passive grass area, and small plantings throughout for use by the surrounding residents. And this area will become owned and maintained by the future condominium corporation. Next slide, please. A detailed look at the proposed landscape plan for the park shows a circular trail, a winding path, and various plantings throughout the park. The proposed trail will be constructed of mulch to ensure minimal ground penetration for further protecting the buried archaeological resources. You will note that the zone boundary does not follow the parking layout. This is because around the perimeter of the park, various infrastructure, including transformer boxes, bicycle parking, infiltration galleries, and vehicle parking. These areas are not subject to the zoning application as they have been disturbed and do not contain archaeological resources. The park as proposed will be passive in nature to ensure the long-term protection of the archaeological resources as outlined and approved by the ministry and Indigenous communities. Next slide. This concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, questions? Councilor McCurry.
Actually, I take that back, Mr. Chairman. I'll wait till the staff come to the table.
Okay, all right. No questions this time, but you'll come forward back up after we have the staff
Great, thank you.
and the public. Thank you. I'll now call on the city staff to present on the application. What do I have here for that? I think I have, yeah, Jeff Medeiros, would you please come forward? And Jeff is the planner on the file presenting the city's case. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of Planning Committee. My name is Jeff Medeiros. I'm a senior planner with the City of Brantford, and I'm here this morning to present the staff recommendation report, which is in front of you, regarding PZ 2022 for 620 Colborne Street West. It's a Planning Act application. It's specifically to amend the city's current zoning bylaw 160-90. It is specifically to deal with a condition of draft plan, a subdivision approval that the applicant has identified, which ultimately will satisfy some of their archaeological requirements associated with the development proposal for the subject lands. Just to provide an overview, and I will go through some of these slides a bit briefly. The applicant did a good job covering I guess most of the items in my presentation this morning. The site is currently being developed into two residential blocks. We refer to them as the East and West block of 620 Colborne Street West. In terms of the context of the neighborhood, as the applicant or the agent applicant has identified, it's primarily residential. There is some commercial uses directly across the street. Brantford Airport is further west of the subject lands. In addition to that, there are some commercial uses further east, and primarily the lands to the south are of environmental in the sense of natural heritage features and trail systems. As the applicant has identified, the city had received an official plan amendment, rezoning, and plan of subdivision approval back in 2017. Those applications were subsequently appealed to the former OMB. In 2021, the LPAT, which had previously was the OMB, had issued their decision to allow for the redesignation, rezoning, and the plan of subdivision. This image that you can see on the screen highlights the different developments in terms of the west and east block. There's a very large natural heritage system that goes through the subject lands. One other component too, which is outside the scope of this proposal, deals with the extension of Dobney Road, which essentially is a cul-de-sac at the end of the road. And a lot of those elements were approved and negotiated through the LPAT process. As the applicant has identified, there is a specific condition, and I won't go into the specifics. It is highlighted in the staff reports. Condition 59, that was a condition that was approved by the LPAT. And essentially what it means is, depending on the results of a stage 3 and 4 report, it would require the applicant to apply for this applicant-initiated rezoning amendment. And what the rezoning amendment does will put the subject area for that particular archaeological site in a very restrictive open space zone to prevent any sort of ground disturbances, as well as to prevent any sort of development and construction. As it relates to the official plan policies, as I said, the LPAT in their decision did approve a redesignation of the subject lands. Last December, there was an administrative amendment that was brought forward to this committee that's highlighted in the staff report. What that administrative amendment completed was to bring the decision that was approved by the LPAT into conformity with the new official plan, which came into effect August of 2021. So with that, the proposed development is permitted, and staff are of the opinion that the rezoning amendment does conform to the official plan here at the city. So specifically, as the applicant has acknowledged, the rezoning only applies to a portion of the west block that's zoned H-R4A -72. There's still a holding in place in that property. The proposed zoning is to go to a site-specific open space zone, and the exception 7 speaks specifically to some of the provisions that are identified in the staff report. So just a high level what those provisions speak to. Like I said, they are identified in the staff report. One in particular limits the use to a private park. So that's the essential amenity area that's proposed for the west block. And it also does prohibit things such as buildings and structures, any sort of excavation, placing, and dumping of fill. As it relates to some development considerations, I guess the most significant component that staff had regard for with respect to this development is the archaeological assessments. There were quite a bit for this property. The one in particular that deals with this particular site has been filed with the ministry, and as a component of the developer's clearances with the ministry deals with partly with the rezoning of these lands to a zone that would prohibit any sort of ground disturbances and as I said before, any sort of development. So with that, the archaeological resources will stay in place and will be covered within this particular open space restrictive zone. With respect to public consultation, at the time of presenting here right now, I've only received one phone call from a resident who was essentially just inquiring about some of the history, and a lot of that detail was covered off in the notification because there is quite a bit of history with these lands, and that's also acknowledged in the staff report for committee's review. Oh, sorry. So the proposed zoning amendment will, as I had acknowledged, will satisfy a requirement of draft plan of subdivision approval. It's consistent with the PPS, conform with the growth plan. It's an appropriate means to preserve the archaeological site in place. It does represent good planning. And just to conclude, staff are recommending approval of the zoning amendment. So with that, if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. We have a number of questions. We first have Councilor McCurry, Councilor Celeste, and Councilor Coley in that order. Councilor McCurry, you have the floor.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Can you indicate why the artifacts are being left in place rather than excavated?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is a decision that was made by the developer, and perhaps they could maybe shed a little bit more light on that, but it is and will be accepted by the ministry. It's not uncommon to have archaeological resources stay in place.
Yeah, we've done that once here historically. And at the time, it seemed to me that there was some import given to not making the location of those artifacts public. So I was a bit surprised to see this today. The cap that's going to be put in place, Jeff, do you know the nature of that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I do know the nature, but I maybe will defer that question to the applicant as well. Typically, there would be a membrane and in different layers of ground material to preserve it. But I would defer that maybe some of the specifics to the applicant agent. They also do have their archaeologists here as well.
Fair enough.
Thank you, Councilor McCurry. Councilor Celeste, you have the floor.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. What's the definition of a private park?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I can easily pull up the zoning bylaw definition, but it's essentially a park that is specific to a development that is privately owned. So in this particular case, it will be owned and managed by the condominium corp and would be exclusive to the residents of that area. So it's not necessarily what I would call a public park, which would be something that typically the city would own and manage accordingly.
So if I wanted to go there with my grandchildren, could I? I don't live there.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't think there'd be anything preventing you from going there, but it wouldn't be typically like something that would be programmed by the city. And as the applicant had identified, there are some limitations in terms of how it's programmed. It's essentially a small green space that is used for passive recreational uses.
Okay. And yeah, because I was trying to get my head around exactly what that meant as well. So could two kids go there and play catch?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would say yes. I don't think there would be any means as to why, two individuals couldn't go there. But once again, it is privately owned. That's the biggest component of it, and would be managed by like a private entity such as the condo corporation. Okay.
So one wouldn't require then some type of identification to get them onto this property. They could, you just wander on.
To you, Mr. Chair, I don't think there's going to be any necessarily security that would prevent individuals from coming on private property. It's just, it wouldn't be something that, the city would be publicly advertising as a public park.
And having said that, the city would not be responsible for maintaining that property.
That's correct. It would be the condo corporation.
Okay. No, there seem to be conflicting statements made. No plantings or earth moving of any kind is one of the statements. Then the next statement says, but you can plant shrubs and grass. You either can or can't. I didn't understand that.
So my understanding of the archaeological requirements of the site is to limit, typical plantings such as trees that would have large root systems. So shrubs and different types of flowers typically wouldn't cause any sort of issues to the capping that's proposed for the archaeological resource, whereas a large mature tree could potentially disturb it. So that's what the intent with those provisions are.
Okay. And just finally, Jeff, is this a means for anybody that owns property that has been identified as serious archaeologically? You can simply build around it, not disturb it, and not have to do all the work that's required to remove the artifacts. Is that an option everybody has, or is this because the minister, or I guess it was LPAT that ordered this?
So through you, Mr. Chair, it is an option, and we have seen a few examples of these sort of situations in other subdivisions. Typically, you would see them in open space areas that are typically undisturbed, but it is an option. And from my understanding, it is going to be accepted by the ministry, subject to the applicant developer completing the appropriate assessments and so forth.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Celeste. Councillor Secoli, you have the floor, ma'am.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question, Jeff. In the presentation with the consultant, she said it would be preferable to keep it open space. Do you know what that might be indicating? Is there an option to do something else with this land?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So with what is being proposed from a zoning perspective, it's very restrictive. The OS3 zone doesn't typically allow for a lot of activities. I mean, if you had a different zone that would be more programmable for, like park spaces and things like that, then it's, it would have different, obviously, provisions in the zoning bylaw. But specifically, my understanding, at least how I would interpret that question, is that it's intended for passive recreational uses. So primarily, it is, an open space area. There's some vegetation, but it is very limited. And it's intended to be used for passive recreational purposes.
So, and just to be clear, this went through the province, has sort of tied our hands with this, and it's moving forward. But the land tribunal says that they have to apply for and receive this zoning amendment. So what happens if, just for everybody watching, because I know we're going to have some questions on it, what happens if we say no today?
So it could potentially impact the registration of their subdivision, or at least parts of the subdivision. Keep in mind, this resource only applies to the west block.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't prevent the development of the east block. Those archaeological clearances are in place right now. And as the report identified, we are actually working towards registration. There's 2 active site plan applications. They are getting close to the finish line. So I would anticipate that the developer will be starting some home construction, at least in the east block, very soon. So to answer your question, in the event that the zoning, is not, approved potentially, it could impact the registration of the subdivision, because that particular clearance does need to be cleared in some shape or form.
Okay, not that I think we should. I don't think there's anything wrong with having more green space when we're building condos. I was just curious as to what the steps would be for them. And the natural heritage lands that falls between these 2 developments, there was some preliminary discussion on the city taking that on and perhaps expanding our trail system through there. Is that something that is still in the works? Have you heard anything on that?
So through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. That's actually a relatively recent development that has occurred between the city and the developer regarding ownership of those lands. There is still some negotiation that's going on with respect to subdivision conditions, but the idea is that the city would assume that block, and potentially there might be some opportunities for programming, but they are very limited. I mean, that is an environmentally sensitive area. There's wetlands and so forth in that area. So there is only so much programming that could occur.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks.
A couple of questions from myself, Jeff,
Okay.
if you don't mind. So if the city assumes the natural heritage lands, we also, the taxpayers, assume the cost of maintenance and of those lands as well. It's not like the developer's giving us a gift. We're giving us an expense, actually.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. But from what is being proposed in terms of trails, it's very limited. As I said, it's a pretty sensitive area. There's only so much opportunities for programming. So there would be potentially some maintenance costs associated with upkeep of the trail systems there, but I would imagine it's going to be quite minimal.
Yeah, pretty minimal. Okay, may even be able to use for education. The West Block one that has the private park in it, that belongs to the condominium. So the condominium will be charged with under their condominium act to maintain that park in perpetuity. Is there fencing going around the condominium corporation itself?
There is some fencing that's being proposed around the corporation. I'd have to go back and look at the landscape plans, but I believe it would be almost the entire block would be fenced, separating between the neighboring properties to the west, and then obviously the natural heritage system as well.
And that open space park counts as the green space for the development itself.
It's, yeah, so it would constitute as part of their amenity space requirement under the zoning bylaw.
Right. Okay. And I think you had said to previous questions from members of council that anybody could attend that property, but it's like, that means anybody could attend Rose Nicoli's backyard or Councillor Sless's backyard because that's private property too. So I would just say that a lot of condominiums have had this kind of difficulty before, even traversing through their property to get to a park. So I think the correct information is it's private property and it would be up to the condominium corporation whether you are able to use it or not.
That's correct. I mean, and a lot of these condos do have these sort of private central amenity areas. It's not an uncommon thing for the city to see.
Right. Okay. And all that stuff is written in the condominium agreement. What has that condominium agreement been? Well, we won't see that, will we?
No. So the city has recently received a plan or standard plan of condo. They do intend on phasing the development into a few different phases. So the chief planner here has delegated approval on that condominium.
But one condominium corporation though, been phased.
That's a good question. I'm not sure if the developer would know the answer to that yet, if they intend on having one corp or multiple corps, but I would maybe defer that question to them.
Okay.
But they are phasing it, correct?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any Councillor McCurry?
Thank you, Chair. So in 15 years from now, when the board of directors of the Condo Corp has turned over 5 times, how does this restriction continue to live on with respect to their governance of their property?
That's a good question. I'm going to defer that one to the applicant. I do not have the answer to that.
Through the chair to Councillor McCurry, Joe Muto, manager of development planning. So one of the real reasons why we're doing this is to ensure that in perpetuity those lands are maintained and nothing's built on them, so that if someone like the Condo Corp goes and says, well, we want to build a gazebo here, the first order of business is to apply for a building
Did you say
permit.
gazebo or casino?
A gazebo or a trellis or something along those lines, Councillor. That wouldn't be permitted based on the zoning. And as you heard in the task force for the zoning bylaw yesterday, our consultants are looking at an open space archaeological zone. So that would then migrate to this as we work through that process and then be maintained in perpetuity.
Thank you.
Any further comments from the committee? Councillor Sless.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, that just sparked something else in my mind. If 10 years down the road, the Condo Corporation in their wisdom just puts a swing set or something in there, who polices that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that would be the Condo Corp.
But if they put it in, if they decide that they want to make a little play area in there for the children in the corporation, and they put it in, who is there to say, no, you can't do that?
It would be the Condo Corp.
Okay.
Right. And typically with a corporation, there would be different members that would approve such a decision, such as that potentially.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sless. Any further questions from the committee? Seeing none, now open the floor to members of the public who wish to speak to this item. We don't have anybody registered at this time, Madam Clerk, so I don't think so. Is there any members of the public wish to speak for this item, to this item? Third and final time, are there any members of the public wish to speak to this item? Is there any, nobody in the chambers? Okay. Okay, clarification statements from the applicant. Would the applicant have any clarification statements they'd like to add? Please come forward.
So to respond to a handful of questions, why are the archaeological resources being left in place? It's best practice. This is a fairly large archaeological find site, and it is best practice to maintain, where possible, archaeological resources in the ground. It is the preferred method through the Indigenous communities as well as the ministry. So there were smaller find sites on the property that weren't of significant magnitude, and it wouldn't have been feasible to maintain them. And in this case, because it's so large, it was seen as the best and most efficient use of the land. And related to the cap makeup, I would ask that our archaeological consultant come up and speak to that.
Okay, in terms of the cap, this is an engineered protective capping, which involves a layer of geotextile on the ground surface, and then a layer of 10 centimeters of clean sand, followed by another layer of geotextile fabric. And the purpose of those geotextile and clean sand is to create a clear delineation between the natural surface and anything above. After that, that second layer of geotextile, there is up to a meter of soil added on top to then provide a very thick layer of soil that can allow the passive use of the park without having any impacts to the lower soil levels or the artifacts below. So the purpose of this cap is to allow the use of the ground surface for passive and general usage with minor shrubbery and things like that, so that will not impact the site, as well as it creates a physical delineation between the additional soils and the clean site. So if somebody is digging in there, which they shouldn't be, they will encounter these layers of soil and sand below. This cap has been used in other situations and is from the ministry's perspective, the gold standard. We've used similar situations in Hamilton, City of London, and other municipalities for similar situations. And it has been developed with consultation of the ministry and the participating Indigenous communities. So this is a fairly intensive process.
Okay. Just to, I guess, go through a couple more points. It is a private park. It will be owned and maintained by the Condo Corporation, not the city. And related to the park programming, it is intended to just be open space with trails. There's no swing set or structures because of the ground penetration, because of not needing to, or not being able to, go through the cap. Related to the plantings, I did note that there was plantings, and those are small shrubs and grass, and those are done on the surface layer of the cap. Nothing big enough like a tree that would then have roots that would penetrate through the cap and potentially affect the resources in the ground. Additionally, there would be planter boxes put on the property, and so plants could be in those as well. I think that was mostly all the comments.
I had questions of clarification of Councilor McCurry and then Councilor Celeste. Councilor McCurry?
Chair, thank you. Thank you for that. Most interesting. So would this have been a site that was continuously inhabited?
Pardon?
The site, would it have been continuously inhabited? It sounds like it's a pretty intensive find.
Yeah, in terms of the archaeological of that site, it dates to the early to mid Archaic period, so around 9,000 to 7,000 years ago. And we don't really have a good sense of whether it was one large continuous site or several repeated use sites on the area. But the timing does match to the other sites that were excavated on the property, but there seems to be a larger concentration in that spot.
So that's one of the earliest inhabitations.
It's relatively early. There are earlier periods, but that is a fairly long time ago. Yes.
And by landscape fabric, you mean by geotechnical fabric, you mean landscape fabric?
Yes.
Like the black sort of meshy stuff? Okay. And is there any signage anticipated?
At this time, I don't believe we're anticipating any signage on the property.
So nothing to identify it. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor McCurry. Councilor Celeste?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Were there areas on the entire property where things were taken out of the ground during your work?
Yes, we excavated on the east side 4 other sites, and on the west side 2 other small sites on the west side of this property. The decision to excavate versus protect was really dependent on the site plan, where things fit, and where the planning was, as well as the size of these sites and the interest of the communities. This site dates a bit earlier than the other ones, which is part of the additional interest versus the other sites that we did excavate. And the location of this site within the original site plan, in that sort of original plan park space, made it a sort of an ideal candidate to protect versus excavate, whereas the other ones were, based on their location and size, were not as suitable.
What type of things did you take out of the ground?
And those sites, mostly, all we found are stone artifacts. So a lot of flakes, so debris from making tools, stone tools. But we also did find projectile points, scrapers, and other evidence of sort of long-term land use in the area.
And when you take these things out, where do they go? Where do they end up?
Currently, they're maintained by the licensed archaeologist as dictated by the province, and we usually transfer our artifacts to a repository. Sustainable archaeology is our preferred choice, but there's two, one in London and one in Hamilton. But it does need the approvals of the Indigenous communities to do those transfers.
Do they go into a warehouse of a sort, or do they go where they're on display, or like? I don't really know the end use.
Yeah, it's the repository is more of a storage facility, which allows people to come in and use them and analyze them and do what they want, as well as request them. There are a lot of restrictions of how the artifacts can be used, stored, and transferred by the ministry. I know the Indigenous communities are always interested in getting the artifacts, but the restrictions and difficulties make it hard to repatriate effectively. But by putting them in a repository, it does allow more long-term use options. So, and for people, of anybody who has interest.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Sless. No further questions. I just have a couple of quick ones. Ms. Rauscher, is this going to be one condo corporation?
Yes, it will be.
Glad to hear that. And the one condo corporation will have on the we're talking about the west side. We'll have the carriage of the whole property, and you'll have into the condominium regulations and rules the actual specifications of the park.
Correct.
What can and can't be done. It'll be pretty detailed so that can't be adjusted.
I believe it's also going to be in the offers of purchase and sale for all new residents in the area.
Okay. Are you having any notices? Just a thought. Are you having any notices about low flying planes? So we're close to the airport. There's no such notice of those.
In the condo declaration?
Yeah.
Offhand, I am not aware of any.
Okay, it's something to give a thought to, because we do that when we're near a railway. So we say near a railway for noise, because then, we get these calls that these planes are flying from the airport, flying over us, and we can hear them. I'm sure that the Councillor Scully's had those comments already. Okay, thank you. Any further comments from the committee? Seeing none, thank you. Looking for someone to put this on the floor. Councillor Sicoli, seconded by Councillor Sless. Questions or comments from the committee? See no comments, we'll call the vote. All those in favor? Yep, cast the vote, yep. Should be on your screen.
Item 4.1 carries unanimously on a recorded vote. Those voting in favor, Councillor Sicoli, Sless, McCreary, and Carpenter.
Thank you. I'll now ask the applicant and the agent to come forward the committee for 103 Peel Ave or Peel Street Shoe and a George Siatek. I see you're here, George, to come forward with you and present your application. Thank you. Welcome, George.
Is George Ziotech, and I'm here on behalf of the applicant as the agent for the applicant. My intent was not to make a presentation in terms of the file. The report has been submitted by the planning department and reviewed. I think it states most of the required material that is being requested for the change of the property from a C7 to an RC zone. And I think most of the material is fairly self-explanatory. The property fits well into the neighborhood, and there is no major issues to be dealt with in respect of the opinion of the applicant. I'm here to answer any questions, if any. The report that was submitted, I think, was fairly comprehensive and fairly straightforward with what is required.
Thank you, George. Any questions from the committee? Councillor Sless.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome. How many parking spots are proposed for the development?
Two parking spots as per the zoning bylaw.
2 in total for the 3 units?
Well, right now, what the intent is to take the existing building and convert it over into a multi-dwelling unit, like a residential conversion unit. It is possible to put in 3 units in there. It'll all depend on the reconstruction, redesign of the dwelling unit itself. But under the current zoning exemptions, 2 would be permitted as tandem parking.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Further questions? Seeing none. Thank you, George.
Okay, thank you.
I'll now call upon city staff, Nicole Goodbrand, to come forward. She has the file for our planning department. Welcome, Nicole.
Sure. Right. Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Nicole Goodbrand, and I am the senior planner here at the city assigned to this file. So the property is currently zoned, as George mentioned, convenience commercial zone or C7. The applicant is requesting to change that zone to permit the conversion of the existing structure into a multi-unit residential building with no associated commercial units. The subject lands are on the southeast corner of Peel and Darling Street, and the property have an area of approximately 357 square meters, or approximately 0.09 acres. The applicants are proposing to utilize the existing structure and convert it from what is currently known as a convenience store with a dwelling unit above into 3 dwelling units within a converted dwelling. They are proposing to utilize the existing driveway for the proposed parking for the dwelling units, and no commercial component is proposed. The application was evaluated with respect to the provincial policy statement, the growth plan, and the official plan, in which staff have determined that the proposed development conforms. The lands are designated residential and neighborhoods in the official plan and are located on a minor collector road and a local road. The property is, as I mentioned, a zoned convenience commercial or C7, and the applicant is proposing to go to residential conversion zone with a site-specific exception to facilitate the residential conversion. In regards to public input and development considerations, in lieu of a neighborhood meeting, a notice was sent out on behalf of the ward councillors to collect feedback on the development. No comments or inquiries resulted from that notice. The notice was circulated to the same area as the statutory notification requirements, so the mapped area there. When evaluating this specific application, the main focus was on compatibility and urban design. So as noted previously, the official plan permits low-rise, mid-rise, and high-rise residential buildings, as well as live-work units, incorporating small-scale retail, etc. The proposed is considered appropriate in the residential designation, including just those residential units in a lower to mid-rise built form. The surrounding area is comprised mainly of residential uses, with the supporting park and open space just kitty corner owned by the city. The proposed development is anticipated to be built back very similar to what existed, as there was a fire within the last year at the site. And it is anticipated to be compatible in massing and scale with the surrounding area. As such, planning staff have no concern with the design and layout of the proposed development. I would note that due to changes resulting from Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act, the proposed development would not be subject to site plan control. So in regards to the site-specific amendments requested, the applicant is requesting a reduction in lot area to recognize the existing lot. And they are also requesting a reduction to the minimum rear yard to permit the existing setback, which you can kind of see there in this picture I took prior to the fire. Commentary on the requests is provided in the report, and overall staff are supportive of the requested relief in the context of this subject application due to the relatively minor nature of them both and the appropriateness given the site context. In regards to the land calculation, 3 units are proposed on this site. The site is approximately 0.04 hectares of land. An assumption of the smallest single detached lots would yield only 1 unit, or in comparison, 3 single detached units would require 0.2 acres of land. Thus showing a better utilization of our existing infill lands. So as previously noted, this application was evaluated with respect to the PPS, the growth plan, and the official plan, in which staff have determined that the proposed development conforms. Planning staff support the application to amend the zoning from convenience commercial to residential conversion zone exception 51 to permit the conversion of the existing structure for a converted dwelling. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Nicole. I do have some questions. Councillor Sless.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nicole, it's indicated that two parking spots are that complies with putting in 3 units. Can you explain that and help me understand that a little better, please?
Yeah, so George kind of alluded to the kind of crux of how that comes to be through the reutilization of the existing structure. So in the current zoning bylaw under section 6.18.2, we do have a clause regarding parking deficiencies, and that allows for the enlargement or change of uses to a permitted use of previously deficient lots, essentially. So if at the time that the bylaw was adopted, the site, which at that time was a convenience store, as well as a dwelling unit, if it was deficient at that time, there's a calculation that we apply to basically recognize the existing deficiency in the proposed change use. So based on that calculation, they're deficient by at least 2 parking spaces for the convenience store, because as you'll remember from the photos, there effectively is no parking for the public. There's just the driveway on the side. And so given those deficiencies and through this clause, the parking is recognized with a slightly reduced parking option. That only applies though if the use is enlarged or changed. If it was eliminated and then recompleted, that parking clause would no longer apply.
Okay. And then further to the parking, in the pictures that were supplied in the background material, the boulevard is paved and there's a car parked on it. Is that a legal parking place?
No. So you can't park on the boulevard. And that was a discussion that was had with the applicants in regards to kind of what that space, that paved space would represent. Our current definition of landscaped open space, when we do that calculation, includes a clause essentially, which may include paths, sidewalks, courts, patios. So in this instance, it was identified that the parking that would be the permitted parking on the site is in that driveway area and that front space, although it would be preferable to be switched to something more permeable, whether it's grass or some other type of landscaping feature, could be considered a patio if used accordingly. But that clause does also exclude parking areas, and so that would be not permitted, no parking in front.
Having said everything that you just said, will that paved boulevard become grass during this process?
So typically that would be something that we would encourage through the site plan process. However, through Bill 23, we no longer have that ability to put a file like this through the site plan control process.
Okay. I guess historically, would the city have paved that, or would that have been done by a private owner?
Through the chair, Councillor Sless. I tried to do some research on kind of the history of the site, and building has some great details. I mean, this use definitely has transitioned from a residential use like more than 100, probably 200 years ago, just based on the initial structure, and then transitioned to have having a convenience store or something similar in that location, and largely in that first kind of component of the structure. So it's likely that it was paved at some point by a previous owner. And it also includes in this something that we've been working with the applicant outside of kind of the scope of planning, but to help him try to address, there's still existing 2 bell boxes that sit out front, if you've driven by it, that were obviously installed at a different era, and recognize that kind of transitory use. So we're working with Bell to try to get those removed from that location.
Good. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Sless. Councillor McCurry.
Chair, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. So as part of our process, we ask a whole bunch of folks if they have an opinion of this, right? We ask Bell Canada, we ask Rogers. A lot of this just is busy work. Have we given any consideration to shortening the list of people who really do need to be contacted?
Through the counselor, and I think Joe could probably speak to it as well. So who we circulate to in some ways is regulated through the O regulations or through the Planning Act.
Okay.
But we do reach out to them. And actually I've been doing that just even for updated information in the past and ensuring basically whether or not they want to be circulated and what types of applications. But through the OREG, we basically have to do that upkeep. And Lisa's been in part of that as well, through the clerk's department, through those requirements.
So Bill 23 doesn't fix that?
No.
Funny, they leave out the bits that are annoying from their point of view, right? Okay. Sorry, bear with me a second. There's no new building construction, right? The construction will all be internal.
Through the chair to Councillor McCurry. So the intent would be to reutilize the site as has been identified to the planning department. There is fire damage. So some external work will likely be required on I think in the 1 foot, you can kind of see the fire damage on the outside of the structure. But the intent that was identified to the planning department through this application was the reutilization of that existing structure.
Yeah.
And that's why we were supportive of including that existing rear yard to try to maximize the use of existing resources.
Okay. So we're engineering has commented that they'd like to see some trees and perennials and grass. Where would you put a tree on the site? Where would you put perennial? I appreciate the commentary, but I'm not so sure that we really should be dictating the details of what we want them to plant. With respect to the climate implications, we seem to be all over the place with respect to how we make our climate commentary on not just your hearing application, but on everything that we do. Is there any consistency in terms of how this item is approached?
Through the chair, I might defer to Joe to speak more of an overarching. I think as an individual, we have our approach guided through our department, but I'll let Joe speak to that maybe from a higher level.
So let me be more precise, Joe. So the climate environmental impacts, we are championing this development because for some reason we think that we should be commenting on building 3 units elsewhere, which isn't before us today. But there's no discussion whatsoever about the climate impact of, and I mean, I'm sorry, this is a bit petty, but it's becoming a thing for me. Okay. We don't address the climate impacts of actually doing the construction itself of the diesel fuel to get the materials there. I think if we're going to talk about climate environmental implications, we should be looking at every project through the same lens. And we don't do that. And I know you guys don't do this bit of the report, but you just happen to be here on the receiving end of it. Thank you.
Through the chair, Heidi DeVries, General Manager, People, Legislative Services and Planning. I just did want to acknowledge that comment by the councillor and say I can take that back to our senior leadership team in terms of consistent approaches across the organization with respect to how we use the climate lens tool that was created for this purpose, to ensure that our reports have greater consistency and that we're reaching out to the climate change officer where we have questions.
it seems to be used as a tool to make, I don't know, social comment rather than actually looking at what the true climate implications are, which I mean are really not at all significant in terms of a little project like this, but you know, if we're going to do this, we should do it and do it consistently, or not do it at all.
Okay, most of those comments aren't germane to this discussion, but you know, I let you go at that point. Any further comments?
And thank you for your indulgence.
It was wearing thin. Any further comments from the committee? I have just one. So the originally it was zoned commercial, and was it zoned commercial and residential? Because it's always been a store many years.
Through you to you, Chair. So it was zoned convenience commercial, which is one of the few uses that allows essentially our corner store, convenience store. And through that use, which the main uses, permitted uses are the commercial ones in nature. Dwelling units are permitted, but they have to be in tandem. So they can have essentially the live work unit. You can have your home above your convenience store or some of the other uses as well. But I believe it caps out at 2 units in addition to that convenience or that convenience.
Got added on over the years.
Yeah, and it can't exist without it. It has to be in tandem with
and hence that's the reason for the application to take the commercial off so that then the 3 units could apply.
Correct.
And 3 units could apply there as a normal right now under Bill 23. You can have 3 units on any residential site, can you not?
So through you to you. So in the previous zoning, the definitions, it still would allow additional units, but not in that form, moving it to an RC zone, which is a residential zone, which allows forms such as converted dwellings or single detached, et cetera, allows those additional uses. And that was the main intent in keeping the additions in that zoning section to make sure that they're still applicable to the future of the site.
And I would just make one note that since we don't have site plan approval, which is probably good for a small project like this and the cost of site plan, but just a note that we might want to mention to our engineering and our park staff that we have a boulevard there that is paved and needs to be cleaned up and a couple of trees should be put in there. It's right across the street from park as well, I noticed. So a couple of trees could be put in there. The boulevard should be cleaned up. We do it all the time when we take out sidewalks in other parts of the ward where someone doesn't want a sidewalk, for example. So just parks can put it on their work order for next year when they're in that neighborhood doing work. Thank you. Did I see your hand go? Councilor McCurry.
Chair, thank you. Could someone venture a cost as to the approximate, a guess as to the approximate cost the applicant would have paid for this application?
Through you to confirm for the application that which they've applied for. Yeah. So through you to you, Councillor McCreary. So they went through a zoning bylaw amendment, a minor zoning bylaw amendment. So it's $10,500, including or with an addition of our engineering review fee.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. Now the floor is open. We don't have anybody that's virtually online to speak to this item. The floor is open for anybody that wishes to speak for or against this project. And the floor is open for anyone who wishes to speak for or against this project. And a third and final time, anyone wishes to speak for or against this project. Seeing none, I now call the applicant. Does the applicant want to come up and answer any further questions or comments? You don't have to. It's up to you. Nope, not necessary. Okay. And again, a mover to put this on the floor. Councilor Spicoli, Councilor McCurry. Questions from the committee? Councilor McCurry.
Would any member of staff like to venture a guess at what our cost to process this application has been? Would it be in the vicinity of $10,000?
Through the chair to Councilor McCreary, it's a very good question. I think the question's been raised in other similar type applications, and based on what council approved at the end of last year, which was implementing some of the matters identified in Bill 109 and Bill 13. We've got a new review process with respect to the delegation of approval for minor rezoning, such as the one that was just before you, as well as the implementation of holding zones, as well as temporary use applications. And so in light of that, and in light of what our consultant Hemson Consulting is doing with respect to looking at our fees through that whole DAP review process, that's something that will be reevaluated. But to give you a number, that's something that we could maybe before council provide you with in terms of how and when that $10,000 figure, which was just referenced with respect to a minor rezoning, was calculated at the time of the existing fee schedule that was approved by council.
Thank you. I think you have enough work to do with chasing your tail over accounting for your costs.
Through the chair, if I could supplement Mr. Muto's response there, because we actually are undertaking a fee review that's much more comprehensive than what we currently do, where we typically calculate, the planner's costs, maybe some development engineering costs, and we look at the overall corporate cost of processing every application that's being conducted through Hemson, using money provided by the province for that purpose. So we will be able to answer that question in a more fulsome way. And we plan on bringing their results to our council for consideration when it comes to setting those fees in the future and making sure that we're capturing our full costs.
Thank you. And maybe some of that information could be available for members of council when this planning report comes forward. Just small application like this, we just would like to make sure and we do as a planning department treat everybody fairly, just to make sure Councilor McCurry's comments are captured. Any further comments? Okay, seeing none, I'll now call the vote. Madam Clerk, please call the vote.
Item 4.2 carries unanimously on a recorded vote. Those voting in favor, Councilors Coley, Sless, McCrary, and Carpenter.
And I believe that's all we have on our agenda for today. We are adjourned. Thank you.